He never called me by my name. For as long as I could remember, my father-in-law referred to me only as the girl Marcus brought home. Not spiteful, exactly. Just distant. Like I was a footnote in a story that had already been written before I arrived. So when Marcus told me his father had asked specifically for me, not for Marcus, not for his sister Diane, but for me, I didn't know what to do with that. "He's been asking for you for 3 days," Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. "I told him you'd stop by this weekend." I nodded and said okay, the way I always said okay, and I didn't tell Marcus that his father had also called me twice on my cell phone. Both times, he'd hung up before I could say more than hello. Both times, I'd stood in our kitchen holding the phone, staring at the wall, not sure what I was supposed to feel. His name was Gerald Holt, 71 years old, retired civil engineer, widower for the past 4 years since Marcus's mother passed from a stroke. He lived alone in the house on Cartwright Lane that he and Eleanor had shared for 38 years. Big yard, covered porch, a kitchen that still smelled like the potpourri Eleanor used to keep on the windowsill. I had only been there a handful of times, and each visit felt like walking through a museum where everything was precious and nothing was meant to be touched. Gerald had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 14 months ago. That was the word Diane used, early stage. She said it the way people say, just a cold, minimizing, reassuring, wrapping something frightening in soft language so it was easier to carry. But I had done my own reading. Vascular dementia didn't get better. It moved at its own pace, sometimes slow, sometimes in sudden drops, and no amount of optimism changed its direction. I went to see him on a Saturday morning in October. Marcus had a golf thing. Diane was taking her kids to a birthday party 2 hours away. I drove out to Cartwright Lane alone, parked in the gravel driveway, and sat in my car for a moment before going in. The porch light was on even though it was 10 in the morning. I knocked. Gerald answered faster than I expected, like he'd been waiting just on the other side of the door. He was dressed neatly, pressed khakis, a blue flannel shirt, and his hair was combed. He looked more put together than he had at Thanksgiving, when Diane had quietly mentioned to me that he'd worn the same shirt 3 days in a row without noticing. "You came," he said. "Of course," I said. He stepped back and let me in. The house was tidy, dishes done, no clutter on the counters. Either he'd cleaned up for me or someone had been by recently. I followed him to the kitchen, where he already had coffee going, 2 mugs set out on the table. We sat down. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at me across the table for a long moment without saying anything. I waited. "I need to show you something," he said finally. "But first I need to know if you're the kind of person who does what's right even when it costs you something." I didn't know how to answer that. I said I hope so. He studied me. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it. "Diane has been coming by twice a week," he said, "bringing groceries, helping with the bills. She handles my accounts online now because my eyes aren't what they were and the computer gives me trouble." "That's good," I said carefully. "That she's been helping." "Is it?" he said. It wasn't really a question. He got up slowly and went to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one Eleanor used to use for coupons and recipe clippings. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder that was thick with papers. He brought it back to the table and set it in front of me. "I want you to look at those," he said, "and tell me what you see." I opened the folder. The top sheet was a bank statement, Gerald's checking account, for the month of August. I scanned the transactions, and almost immediately something caught my attention. A transfer out. $1,200 to an account I didn't recognize, labeled only with a reference number. I turned to the next statement. July. Another transfer. This one for $1,800. June. $3,200. I kept going. My hands were steady, but my pulse wasn't. The transfers went back 9 months. Different amounts, different dates, but the same destination account. Added together, they came to just over $40,000. I looked up at Gerald. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between relief and grief, like a man who'd been carrying a weight alone and had finally found someone willing to hold the other end. "When did you notice?" I asked. 3 months ago, he said. "I was looking for something in the desk and I found a statement that had come in the mail. Diane usually gets the mail, but she'd been out of town that week and I got it myself." He paused. I called the bank. They told me the transfers had been authorized, had my signature. "Did you authorize them?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember signing anything like that," he said. "But with my condition," he stopped. "That's the problem. I don't always know what I don't remember." That sentence hit me somewhere deep. I don't always know what I don't remember. I had to take a breath before I could keep going. I looked through the rest of the folder. Mixed in with the bank statements were other documents, a change of beneficiary form on his life insurance policy dated 4 months ago, with Gerald's signature. An amendment to his will, adding a provision that in the event of incapacitation, Diane would have sole control of all financial assets. A power of attorney, signed and notarized. I spread the documents out on the table slowly, carefully. The way you handle something you're not sure is stable. "Have you talked to Marcus about any of this?" I asked. "No," he said. "Why not?" He looked down at his coffee. "Because Diane told him I've been confused lately, mixing things up. She told him the doctors said my memory is getting worse faster than expected." He paused. "I heard her on the phone with him last month. She didn't know I was in the hall." I felt something cold move through me. Not dramatic, not a sudden chill, just a quiet, settling cold, like a room where the heat has been off for a long time. "What did she say?" I asked. "She said Dad's not doing well, that he'd gotten upset about the bills and accused her of stealing, but the doctors said that kind of paranoia was common at this stage. She said we might need to start thinking about memory care." He said the words flatly, without inflection. She said it in a very calm voice. Very sad, very concerned. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Gerald," I said, "do you know why you called me? Why not Marcus, or a lawyer, or—" "I called Marcus," he said. "He told me I should let Diane handle things, that I should trust her." He looked at me directly. "And I did call a lawyer, the one who did my will. His office said Diane had called ahead and told them I'd been having episodes of confusion and that any instructions I gave by phone might not reflect my actual wishes." He paused. "I don't know if that's true. I don't know what I've said or signed that I don't remember. But I know what I want now, in this moment. And what I want now is for someone to look at these papers and tell me if I'm wrong." "You're not wrong," I said. He exhaled. Just once, quietly, like he'd been holding it for months. I took out my phone and asked if I could take photos of everything in the folder. He said yes. I photographed every page, every signature, every date and reference number, and then I sat back down across from him and I said, "I'm going to need to make some calls. I don't want you to tell Diane that we talked." He nodded once. "I know how to keep quiet," he said. "I've had practice." I drove home with Gerald's folder on the passenger seat, and my mind running through everything I'd seen. I was a paralegal. I had been for 6 years, at a small firm that handled mostly estate and probate work. I was not a lawyer, and I was careful never to act like one, but I knew how documents were supposed to look. I knew what a valid signature looked like, versus one that had been produced under duress or coercion. And I knew that a change of beneficiary form and a will amendment and a power of attorney all executed within a 4-month window, in a man with a documented cognitive decline, was not a thing that happened cleanly. I called my supervising attorney on Monday. His name was Daniel Reeves, and he had been doing estate litigation for 22 years. I told him I had a personal situation and asked if I could walk him through it hypothetically. He said sure. I walked him through it. By the end, he wasn't saying hypothetically anymore. "You need a forensic document examiner," he said, "and you need a physician who can do a capacity assessment, not the one Diane's been using, someone independent. If those signatures were obtained when he lacked capacity, they're voidable, possibly void." "What about the power of attorney?" I asked. "If he lacked capacity when he signed it, it was never valid. Doesn't matter that it's notarized." He paused. "Who's the notary?" I checked my photos. I read him the name. A pause on his end. "That notary works for Diane's husband's accounting firm." I sat very still. "Okay," I said. "Okay." It took 4 weeks. 4 weeks of phone calls I made from my car in parking lots so Marcus wouldn't hear. 4 weeks of document examination and medical consultation and careful conversations with Gerald that I kept short and simple so as not to tire him. The capacity assessment came back clearly. Gerald Holt was experiencing cognitive decline, yes. But on the dates those documents had been signed, according to the timeline established by his medical records, he had been in a period of relative stability. His neurologist had noted in her records from those months that he was alert, oriented, and communicating clearly. He had not been in one of the fog periods that came and went unpredictably. He had been, medically speaking, capable of understanding what he was signing, which meant the question became, had he actually chosen to sign them? The forensic examiner looked at the signatures on the transfers, the will amendment, and the power of attorney. She compared them to Gerald's known signatures from the previous 2 years: checks, birthday cards, the lease renewal on his truck. She found consistent pressure irregularities on 3 of the 5 disputed signatures. Signs of a hand being guided, or a signature produced slowly and carefully in a way that suggested the signer was copying rather than writing naturally. 2 of the signatures, she said, were likely not Gerald's at all. The day I had to tell Marcus, I sat across from him at our kitchen table the same way I'd sat across from his father, and I put the folder between us, and I said his name once so he would look up from his phone. He looked at the papers for a long time without saying anything. "She's my sister," he said finally. "I know," I said. "She's been taking care of him. She's been over there twice a week for a year." "I know," I said again. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a while with his back to me. I waited, the way I was learning to wait. "What do we do?" he said. "We call Daniel," I said. "Tonight." The civil case was filed on a Thursday. Diane was served on a Friday. She called Marcus 6 times before noon. He didn't answer. She called me once, which was the first time she had ever called me directly, and she said my name, my actual name, not Marcus's wife or her, and said that I had completely misunderstood the situation, that Gerald had been fully informed of everything, that she had documentation of every conversation, and that I was going to regret inserting myself into something that had nothing to do with me. I let her finish. Then I said, "Diane, I'm a paralegal. I've read every document. You should call your attorney." And I hung up. The civil case moved faster than these things usually do, because Daniel was very good at his job, and because the evidence was not subtle. The transferred funds were traced. The notary, when presented with the timeline and the capacity assessments, amended her statement to indicate that she had notarized the documents as a professional courtesy without independently verifying the signatory's capacity, which was a violation of her professional obligations and, as it turned out, also a problem for the accounting firm that employed her. Diane's attorney tried twice to argue that Gerald had simply been more capable on some days than others, and that the documents reflected his genuine wishes during a clear period. Daniel put Gerald on the phone with the court-appointed evaluator. Gerald talked for 40 minutes about the transfers, about the phone calls he'd made that had been routed through Diane's intervention, about the documents he'd found in the desk. He was clear and specific and entirely coherent. At one point, the evaluator asked him how he was doing emotionally with all of it. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter did this to me. I keep trying to find a reason that makes it hurt less. I haven't found one yet, but at least now I know I wasn't losing my mind." 3 months after I'd sat in that kitchen on Cartwright Lane, I sat in a conference room and watched a judge review the settlement that had been reached. The $40,000 in transferred funds would be returned. The will amendment and the power of attorney were declared void. A new, independent fiduciary was appointed to assist Gerald with his finances going forward. The change of beneficiary form on the life insurance policy was revoked. The criminal matter was referred to the district attorney. That was a separate process, and a slower one, and I couldn't predict how it would go. But it was moving. Afterward, Gerald and I sat in Daniel's parking lot in my car for a few minutes before I drove him home. He didn't say very much. He looked out the windshield at the ordinary afternoon, the strip mall across the street, the pigeons on the power line, the woman pushing a stroller down the sidewalk, and he seemed to be taking it in with particular attention, the way you look at something you almost lost. "I owe you an apology," he said, not looking at me. "You don't," I said. "For all the years I didn't," he stopped. "You were always kind to Eleanor. I noticed that. I just didn't say so. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just sat there with it for a moment." "She would have liked you," he said, "if I'd let her know you better." I drove him home. I walked him to his porch. He unlocked the door, then paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at me. "What's your name?" he said. "Your first name. I want to use it." "Claire," I said. "Claire," he repeated carefully, like he was putting it somewhere he intended to keep it. "Thank you, Claire." He went inside. I stood on the porch for a moment in the October air before I walked back to my car. On the drive home, I thought about what he'd said in the evaluator's call. I keep trying to find a reason that makes it hurt less. I hadn't found one either. Not for him, not for Marcus, not for the version of Diane I'd thought I knew at family dinners and holiday tables. There was no reason that made it hurt less. There was only what you did with it. I had inserted myself into something that had nothing to do with me, Diane had said. She was wrong about that. She'd been wrong from the start. When you marry someone, you marry their family, the warmth of it and the weight of it, and the parts that are harder to look at. Gerald was Marcus's father, which made him mine too, in the way that mattered. And whatever the law said, whatever the courts decided, whatever Diane told herself in the quiet of her own house in the way that mattered, Gerald was family. And family was exactly what this had everything to do with. Marcus and I drove out to Cartwright Lane for dinner the following Sunday. Gerald made pot roast, which he said had been Eleanor's recipe, and he used too much salt, and the carrots were slightly overcooked, and the three of us sat at that kitchen table and ate every bite. He called me Claire both times he spoke to me. I didn't say anything about it. I just made a note of it privately, the way you make note of the small things that turn out to matter.